For decades, fat was treated as the enemy. Many people grew up hearing that eating fat would make you gain weight, raise cholesterol, and damage your health. But nutrition science has evolved, and the story is far more complex. In this episode, we explore the difference between healthy fats, harmful fats, misunderstood fats, and the major historical mistake of replacing fat with sugar and ultra-processed foods. No nutrition fear-mongering, no trendy extremes, no simplistic answers, just clear, modern, evidence-based science. Medicine beyond the obvious, health explained with depth and evidence.
So for 40 years, we basically engineered the fat entirely out of our food. And we genuinely believed we were, saving our hearts and our waistlines.
You're right. Absolutely.
I mean, think about walking down those supermarket aisles filled with, fat-free cookies and skim milk yogurt. We really thought we had finally outsmarted human biology.
We really did.
But as the NIH data in today's deep dive reveals, the exact products we engineered to save us were actually the ones making us fundamentally sick. The very rules we followed to the letter accidentally triggered a massive public health crisis.
Yeah, and we are looking at a really fascinating, highly comprehensive document today. It's titled Gordura.pbf-FASH, which literally translates to fat.
Okay, Gordura. Got it.
And it pulls together decades of data. We're talking primary research from the National Institutes of Health, the American Heart Association, and these major cardiovascular meta-analyses. It basically performs a forensic investigation into how a well-intentioned scientific hypothesis just went so incredibly wrong.
And if you have ever felt overwhelmed by conflicting diet advice, or wondered why the nutritional goalposts seem to move every 5 years, this deep dive is going to finally make sense of all that chaos.
Exactly. It's so confusing for people.
It is. So we are ditching the dietary terrorism and the fear-mongering today. We're going to look under the hood of human metabolism to understand the honest, complex science of dietary fat. And more importantly, the totally unintended consequences of trying to remove it.
Right, because to really understand the facts we have today, we first have to look at the logical foundation of that whole 1970s and 80s low-fat craze.
The era of the Snackwell's cookie.
Oh, exactly. The green boxes everywhere. But the initial logic wasn't malicious at all. We all know the basic math, right? Fat packs roughly 9 calories per gram, whereas carbohydrates and proteins, well, they only carry 4.
So, the historical assumption wasn't entirely crazy on paper.
No, not at all.
The thermodynamic argument makes mathematical sense. If you want a population to eat fewer total calories and lose weight, you instruct them to cut the most calorie-dense macronutrient, which is fat.
The math made sense. And the early kind of isolated clinical observations seemed to back it up too. Researchers were seeing that saturated fat could raise LDL cholesterol.
Right.
And at the very same time, they were watching this rapidly growing epidemic of cardiovascular diseases. So they basically connected these isolated data points into a straight line.
Which was what?
Basically. Fat has the most calories, saturated fat raises LDL, and heart disease is rising. Therefore, fat must be the root cause.
But taking that straight line and just applying it to complex human biology is exactly where the NIH data shows the math fundamentally broke down.
It broke down hard.
Because when the food industry responded by removing the fat from everyday products, they ran into a very physical problem.
Right.
Fat carries flavor compounds.
Oh, absolutely.
It provides the texture and that satisfying mouthfeel of food. If you just industrially strip the fat out of, say, a muffin or a salad dressing, you are left with something that tastes and feels like damp cardboard.
Yeah, no one is going to buy damp cardboard. So manufacturers had to replace that lost fat with something else just to make the products edible and shelf-stable.
And what did they use?
They turned to refined sugars, processed starches, and engineered flours. They created this entire ecosystem of highly processed, low-fat foods.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like taking the heavy engine out of a car to make it lighter, but then replacing it with hundreds of pounds of useless sand.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Right, and doing that completely sabotaged our internal hunger signals. The refined sugar and starches just burn up in a flash. It spikes the heat for a few minutes, but an hour later you are freezing again and throwing more paper on the fire.
Yes.
Whereas natural fats, on the other hand, are like dense oak logs. They burn slowly. They keep you warm and satiated all day.
That mechanism of satiety is just crucial here, because when you consume natural fats, Your digestive system naturally releases hormones like cholecystokinin.
Cholecystokinin.
Right, and that hormone travels to your brain and physically signals that you are full. You just naturally stop eating. But when you swap those fats for refined carbohydrates, you bypass that satiety mechanism entirely.
So people were eating these fat-free products, feeling completely unsatiated, and their blood sugar was just going on a roller coaster ride.
A massive roller coaster. Blood sugar spikes aggressively, right? And that triggers a massive release of insulin just to clear the sugar from your bloodstream.
Wow.
And that insulin surge causes your blood sugar to crash rapidly a couple hours later, which your brain, of course, interprets as an emergency need for more quick energy.
So it leaves you aggressively hungrier than before you even ate.
Exactly. And the NIH findings explicitly point out this unintended consequence. The population was suddenly consuming massive amounts of highly processed, low-fat foods that functionally drove them to overconsume total calories.
But I have to challenge the scientific community of that era, honestly. Like, did policymakers simply not test these low-fat, high-sugar replacement products in long-term trials before recommending them to the entire public?
It sounds crazy now, but no, not in the way they should have.
I mean, we were told calories in, calories out.
Yeah.
If we were cutting the fat calories, why didn't we notice the obesity rates climbing instead of falling?
It was just a profound case of tunnel vision. The establishment was so intensely focused on lowering total fat intake and, lowering total serum cholesterol that they totally neglected the holistic reality of human metabolism.
They missed the forest for the trees.
Exactly. They were looking at isolated biomarkers rather than the overarching metabolic health of the actual patients. They assumed that as long as the fat was reduced, the intervention was a success.
Regardless of what the substitutes were doing to insulin and hunger.
Right. Regardless of the actual real-world outcome.
Because society completely panicked about the sheer density of calories and fat, we just ignored the actual biological mechanisms of how different types of fat behave inside our bodies. And the source material highlights this as the next massive scientific error.
Yeah. What's fascinating here is how grouping all fats together under one terrifying umbrella completely destroyed our understanding of nutrition.
Yeah.
We basically treated a wildly complex, diverse category of macronutrients as if it were just one single, homogeneous substance.
Which is crazy. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because lumping all fats together is a biological absurdity. It's honestly like saying all liquids are exactly the same, whether you were drinking water or gasoline.
That's a great analogy.
So let's break down what the cardiovascular meta-analyses actually show about these different types of fat. Starting with unsaturated fats, the ones found in olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds, and fatty fish.
The good stuff.
Right. We've always heard these are the heroes of the Mediterranean diet, but why? Like, how do they actually protect the heart?
Well, it really comes down to cellular architecture. The primary prevention studies on the Mediterranean diet demonstrate that consuming unsaturated fats, like omega-3 fatty acids, fundamentally improves your cardiometabolic profile.
Okay, but how?
Because these fats are literally incorporated into the walls of your cells, the molecular structure of unsaturated fat is very fluid and flexible. So when your cell membranes are built with these flexible fats, the cells just function better.
They communicate better.
Yes, they communicate more efficiently, and they are far less prone to systemic inflammation.
Oh, wow. So we were actively telling people to avoid the exact structural building blocks that keep their cardiovascular system flexible and healthy.
Exactly.
That is a heavy realization. What about saturated fats, though, like butter, whole dairy, fatty meats? Because this was the ultimate demon of the 1980s. I mean, the slogan was literally, saturated fat clogs your arteries like grease in a pipe.
Right, the old plumbing analogy. But the reality revealed by recent meta-analyses is vastly more complex than that. The effect of saturated fat on your body heavily depends on the food matrix.
Wait, let's pause there and clarify. When you say food matrix, do you mean the physical structure of the food itself actually changes how the fat enters my bloodstream?
That is the exact mechanism. Think about the saturated fat in a piece of, fermented aged cheese or whole milk yogurt. It is naturally encased in a complex physical matrix of proteins, calcium, and milk fat globule membranes.
Yeah.
Because of that physical structure, your digestive enzymes, which are called lipases, have to work much harder and slower to access the fat. It breaks down gradually.
So you don't get a sudden aggressive spike in blood lipids.
Exactly. Compared to the extracted, heavily processed fat in something like a commercially produced hot dog, which has basically no natural matrix left.
It just hits your system all at once.
Right. The processed fat hits your system entirely differently. And beyond the food matrix, the health impact of saturated fat depends heavily on what you are actually replacing it with.
Ah, the substitution effect.
Yes. If a population swaps butter for extra virgin olive oil, cardiovascular risk demonstrably goes down. But if they swap butter for refined carbohydrates, which remember was the standard advice of the low-fat era, their cardiovascular risk actually goes up.
Wow. Then, of course, the sources outline the actual, undeniable villains of this story. Industrial trans fats.
Yeah.
Partially hydrogenated oils.
Yes. These are artificially created in a lab. They basically bombard liquid vegetable oils with hydrogen gas to make them solid at room temperature.
Why would they even do that?
Because the food industry loved them. They made baked goods incredibly shelf-stable. I mean, you could leave a trans fat-laden pastry on a shelf for months, and it simply wouldn't go bad.
That sounds terrifying, honestly. But if we go back to that cellular architecture you mentioned earlier, how do these artificial trans fats behave when they actually get into our bodies?
Well, they do the exact opposite of those flexible omega-3s. Industrial trans fats have this straight, totally unnatural molecular shape that packs really tightly together.
Oh no?
Yeah. So when your body mistakenly uses them to build cell membranes, those cellular walls become rigid, stiff, and highly prone to damage.
And that leads to inflammation.
Massive inflammation. The AHA and NIH data show robust, totally unequivocal evidence that these fats drive intense systemic inflammation, they aggressively raise bad cholesterol, and they actively lower the protective good cholesterol.
Thankfully, the scientific community caught on to that mechanism, and trans fats have been heavily restricted or just outright banned in many parts of the world.
Right, finally.
But this historical inability to distinguish between the flexible, healthy cell builders and the rigid, toxic trans fats led to what the sources call the grand substitution.
Yes, the grand substitution. We systematically swapped real, complex foods containing natural fats for highly engineered, heavily processed products containing refined sugars.
And the sources outline the very practical, everyday tragedies of this era. I mean, you had people genuinely trying to improve their health, making terrible biological trades.
Oh, all the time.
They were taking nutrient-dense almonds out of their lunchboxes and replacing them with, like, light, highly processed crackers.
Yeah.
They dropped satiating whole milk yogurt for zero-fat desserts that were just loaded with added sugar and artificial colors. Essentially, we removed real food and replaced it with products.
And that exact swap is what confused the population for decades.
Right.
We created a single dietary villain in fat, which totally blinded us to the reality of what we were actually consuming. We stopped looking at food as food.
We just started looking only at isolated macronutrients on a nutrition label.
Exactly.
Which forces us to ask a very pointed question about the whole low-fat movement. So we swapped natural fat for refined sugar and processed starches in the name of stopping obesity. But what did that massive influx of refined sugar actually do to our internal biology? Like, did taking out the fat actually prevent us from getting fat?
Well, no. And a major part of the answer lies in how our bodies process liquid sugar, specifically fructose, which is a key component of the high fructose corn syrup they use to replace fat in so many of these products. Now, every cell in your body can use glucose for energy, but fructose can only be processed by the liver.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So when you flood the system with liquid sugar, like a fat-free sweetened beverage, the liver gets completely overwhelmed.
It just can't process that much energy at once.
Exactly. So it does the only thing it can. It converts that excess sugar directly into visceral fat, and it packs it right into the liver cells themselves.
Oh, wow.
And as the liver becomes fatty, it stops responding efficiently to insulin. This is the very beginning of insulin resistance.
So your pancreas just has to work overtime.
Right, your pancreas has to pump out more and more insulin just to keep your blood sugar at a normal level.
And as you mentioned earlier, high insulin is a storage hormone. It locks away energy in our fat cells and blocks us from burning it, which keeps us chronically hungry.
Yes.
Which completely upends the core myth we have been trying to unpack here. Does eating fat inherently cause weight gain? I mean, the NIH research concludes that does fat make you fat is fundamentally a broken question.
This raises an important question, though. How did we ever think health could fit into a single, isolated nutrient?
I know.
Because that old question assumes human digestion is just a simple combustion engine, where calories in equal calories out, totally devoid of any hormonal context.
But it's not.
No. Weight gain certainly requires a chronic energy excess over time, but that energy excess happens within a fiercely complex biological environment, We're talking about appetite, sleep quality, stress hormones, and crucially, the quality of the food itself.
So wait, this completely rewrites the whole a calorie is a calorie argument.
It really does.
It's like, if I eat 500 calories of wild-caught salmon and avocados, my body releases satiety hormones, my cell membranes get those flexible building blocks, and my blood sugar remains perfectly stable. But if I eat 500 calories of fat-free sugary cookies, my liver just gets slammed, my insulin spikes, and 2 hours later, my brain is screaming at me to eat again. So the type of calorie dictates all these biological levers that control how much I end up eating overall. That changes everything.
And the clinical studies referenced by the NIH demonstrate this beautifully. They found that diets with wildly varying proportions of fat, ranging from very high fat all the way to very low fat, can produce remarkably similar weight loss results.
Really? Similar results?
Yeah, because the physiological success of a diet does not hinge on hitting some magic percentage of fat versus carbohydrates. It hinges entirely on long-term adherence to eating high-quality, nutrient-dense foods. Foods that naturally regulate those hormonal levers.
And the exact same complexity completely dismantles our old fears about cholesterol, too. Because the 1980s map was frighteningly simple. Eat dietary fat, your LDL cholesterol goes up, and you die of a heart attack.
Right. And yes, certain types of saturated fat can influence LDL cholesterol concentrations. But modern cardiovascular science shows that real heart disease risk cannot be reduced to a single lipid marker on a blood test.
It's way bigger than that.
It is a dense, interacting web of metabolic factors.
A meta-analysis in the source material outline this web, and it is extensive. I mean, it involves that systemic inflammation we talk about. It involves the physical blood pressure damaging the delicate lining of your arteries, your genetics, your physical activity, your smoking status. And critically, it involves your triglycerides.
Yes, triglycerides. They are a vital piece of this puzzle that was largely just ignored during the low-fat era.
What are they exactly?
Triglycerides are essentially the amount of fat actively circulating in your blood. And what drives triglycerides dangerously high, it is typically not the dietary fat you eat.
Wait, really?
No, it is the overconsumption of refined carbohydrates and sugars, which the liver converts into circulating fat.
Oh, man. So the very fat-free, high-sugar diets we were prescribed to protect our hearts were often the exact things driving up our triglycerides and sparking the insulin resistance that actively damage our cardiovascular systems.
Exactly.
You simply cannot isolate dietary fat and blame it for a systemic metabolic failure, especially when the individual is stressed out, underslept, and running on processed sugar.
No, you can't. And this realization requires a massive paradigm shift in how we approach nutrition today.
So if we abandon the macronutrient wars, the endless fighting over whether low carb or low fat is superior, what does the solid, evidence-based roadmap actually look like? Like, if I'm listening to this and I just want to know how to navigate the grocery store today without needing a degree in biochemistry, what does the science say?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the most crucial shift in modern nutritional epidemiology is moving the focus entirely away from macronutrients and placing it squarely on the level of food processing.
So it's no longer about the nutrient, it's about the factory.
That's a great way to put it. The current evidence-based consensus prioritizes minimally processed whole foods, and the sources are highly specific about this protective dietary pattern.
What's on the list?
It includes extra virgin olive oil, nuts, seeds, fatty fish, a wide variety of vegetables, whole fruits, natural dietary fibers, and intact whole grains.
And when you look at that list, you realize they all share the same fundamental characteristic,
Right.
They retain their natural, complex cellular architecture.
Yes.
They still have the food matrix we discussed earlier. They contain their original fibers, which feed the gut microbiome, and their natural fats, which provide that slow-burning, satiating energy.
Exactly. And on the restrictive side of the roadmap, the directive is equally clear. We need to aggressively reduce our intake of ultra-processed foods.
Right.
We must minimize liquid sugars that overwhelm the liver, avoid continuous massive caloric excess, and maintain the absolute elimination of industrial trans fats. Because today we know health unequivocally depends on context.
Your overarching dietary pattern and your lifestyle.
Yes. It is never about obsessing over a single molecular villain.
There is a deep, almost comical irony to all of this. After decades of complex, lab-engineered, low-fat diets, after literally billions of dollars spent formulating the perfect fat-free snack, the ultimate cutting-edge conclusion from our top scientific institutions is simply to eat real, minimally processed food.
I know, right?
The exact same foods our great-grandparents were eating before we decided we could outsmart millions of years of human evolution with a chemistry set.
It is deeply ironic, but for anyone who has struggled with diet anxiety for years, it is also incredibly liberating.
It really is.
It frees you from the exhausting task of tracking and micromanaging every single gram of fat you consume.
Which brings us to what this all means for you listening right now. The ultimate takeaway from Gordura.pdf, the NIH data, and the cardiovascular meta-analyses is that the question is never simply, is fat bad?
No, that overly simplistic question is completely dead.
Right.
The correct framework, the one that modern metabolic science absolutely demands we use, relies on 5 contextual questions. Which fat, in which diet, in what quantity, in what person, and substituting what?
Think about how radically those questions change the conversation. Like, which fat are we talking about, an avocado rich in flexible cellular building blocks or a chemically hydrogenated oil that stiffens your arteries?
Huge difference.
In which diet? Is this fat part of a vibrant, fiber-rich Mediterranean diet? Or is it sitting on top of a highly processed, refined flour pizza?
Right.
In what quantity? Are you eating a handful of walnuts? Or are you in a continuous state of extreme caloric excess? In what person? What is your genetic background, your daily physical activity, your baseline metabolic health?
Context is everything.
And finally, the question that defined the greatest nutritional error of the 20th century. Substituting what? Like, if you remove this dietary fat, are you replacing it with whole protein and fibrous vegetables? Or are you replacing it with a heavily processed, sugar-laden dessert?
Exactly. When scientific understanding matures, the simple binary black and white rules disappear. And as the source material points out, the death of the fat is evil myth is actually a tremendous sign of progress.
Yeah.
It means we are finally looking at the intricate, interconnected reality of human biology rather than just some cartoonish simplification.
We are finally using a map that reflects the actual terrain of our metabolism. But as we wrap up this forensic investigation into the history and science of dietary fat, the data leaves us with a final, somewhat unsettling thought.
Oh.
We spent 40 years terrified of an essential macronutrient. The entire scientific community, the global food industry, and government policymakers were near universally wrong about fat, largely because they desperately wanted a simple enemy to blame for complex systemic diseases.
The establishment craved an easy target, and they just ignored the unintended biological consequences of their solution.
So here is the question I want you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If the brightest minds in science and medicine could be that catastrophically wrong about a fundamental human nutrient for 4 decades, simply because they lacked a holistic perspective, what current, universally accepted simple health rule are you diligently following today that future generations will look back on as another massive, well-intentioned historical error? Just like that old low-fat map, maybe the simple directions we trust the most right now are exactly what's keeping us lost.